start talking a little bit. If you'll keep an eye on the waiting room, please.
Sound good? Yeah, absolutely.
You're real fine. Well, ladies and gentlemen, those of you who have joined us thus far, I welcome you tonight to another outstanding virtual education program sponsored by the Friends of Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. And I hope that some of you are aware that there is a National Wildlife Refuge in northwest Ohio near Toledo. It is the only refuge in Ohio, which makes us somewhat unique. I am Tom Romito, your host, and I am a board member of the Friends of Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, and my co-host is TJ Singa, who lives in Sylvania. I live in Cleveland, and we both serve on the board. The Friends of Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge is the fundraising arm of Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. And what that means is that we raise funds to support the refuge in a myriad number of ways. One way is that we raise funds to hire interns to serve on the refuge, to augment the refuge staff, which is woefully understaffed and underfunded. And we do this fundraising through events that we hold to the public. We seek grants from small family foundations in Ohio. We've done that quite successfully in the past 3 years. We also seek funds to buy wetlands, which are small parcels of former farmlands that the owners have turned into wetlands. And we try to buy them up and sell them to the refuge. So we buy these things from the owners and we turn around and sell them to the refuge. That's a revolving land acquisition fund that we have going. So the refuge manages 10,700 acres of wetlands between Port Clinton, Ohio, and Cedar Point. And the main refuge is right near north of Oak Harbor, north of Route 2. And it's the main campus of the refuge is huge. And if you'll ever go there, you'll see that. We have a visitors center there, a beautiful center that's about 15 years old. Okay, tonight, Erika Lyon is going to cover the ecology and identification of fungi, along with the basics of hunting wild mushrooms. She'll also cover some common fungi found in the Lake Erie region. Erika is the OSU Agriculture and Natural Resource Extension Educator for Jefferson and Harrison Counties. Prior to joining OSU, she received her master's in Ecology and Environmental Sciences from the University of Maine while working in the areas of mycology and plant mythology. Erika, we'd love to know what those are, plant mycology and pathology. And she frequently coordinates programs related to wild and gourmet mushrooms. Sounds good. And with that having been said, Erika, before I turn it over to you, I'm going to ask everybody to keep themselves muted for the moment. The chat room is there for you to put questions into. And Erika, I'd like to ask you this. As people put questions into the chat room, do you want us to hold those questions until the end, or do you want us to kind of interrupt you when you pause and feed you that question, which may be germane for the topic that you're on at the moment? What would you like to do?
Yeah, so my presentation is broken out into sections, so we can go through questions after each section.
Sounds great. Thank you very much. Okay, folks, so do that. Put them in the chat room if you would, and we'll field them as we see them. So if you at the end you can talk, we'll ask you to unmute and talk if you wish to. Erika, I will now turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Tom.
By the way, excuse me, TJ is going to put into the chat room 3 links. These links pertain to this program. First of all, the refuge itself, we have a website. Secondly, we have an events page, which is a separate link. And thirdly, we have a survey at the end that we're going to ask you to take just by clicking on it. And that's the third link. Okay, go, Erika, your turn.
Thanks, Tom.
You're,
I'm gonna share my screen. So are you seeing my presentation?
I am.
Yes, we can see it.
If anybody
Okay.
cannot see it, please let us know by putting something in the chat room.
So yeah, thank you so much for having me here tonight. Yeah, my name's Erika Lyon. I've worked with OSU Extension now. I can't believe it's already almost year 7. Time goes by really fast when you're having fun. So tonight I'm going to be talking about mushrooms. How I got into this field was during my graduate studies at University of Maine. I was there for ecology and environmental science, but really my thesis was focused on plant pathogens of blueberry. So blueberry is a very interesting crop. So I had to take several plant pathology and mycology classes and really found that I liked talking about mushrooms in general and other fungi. So that's how I got here. So we're going to cover today the wild mushrooms of the Western Lake Erie Basin. A lot of the mushroom species that I'll talk about towards the end of the presentation can actually be found across Ohio and in general New England and the Midwest, but there are some that are at least reported fairly frequently around the National Wildlife Refuge. So just as a disclaimer, this presentation is for educational purposes only and should not serve as a guide to identify individual mushrooms that are edible. A lot of the photos that I'll be showing during the presentation, sometimes photos can be deceiving, and you'll find that a lot of mushrooms have variation in how they appear within a species. So that's something to keep in mind. Proper identification is ultimately up to the mushroom hunter using a good field guide. So you need to think about, why is it that you want to hunt mushrooms? Probably the most common thing that comes to mind is maybe you're hunting them or foraging them as a food source. And there are quite a few mushrooms out there that are considered to be edible, and we'll talk a little bit more about those here in a minute. But there are other reasons to go hunt for mushrooms. Personally, myself, I don't go out to hunt for edible mushrooms. I tend to have an allergy to many of them, but they come in all different shapes, all different colors, and it's just really cool once you get to know what to look for. It's kind of a mystery on what you'll unearth while out on a hike. One of my hobbies, I've been slacking on it lately, but I also like to take pictures. And if you're into photography, mushrooms are some of the most gorgeous things to photograph. So while you're out hunting for mushrooms, there is some general etiquette that you should follow. Here in Eastern Ohio, we've got a lot of private property owners that have really great, a lot of diversity in terms of the fungi that are on their property. And of course, a lot of them have edible fungi such as chanterelles and morels on their property. If you're going on private property, always ask for permission. A lot of times we don't think about this, but there's a bit of a liability that's taken on by the landowner whenever someone goes onto their property. And then of course, there's the matter of, do they want you there or not? Are there any safety hazards? So it's just common courtesy to go talk to them. Most of the time, if you ask, a lot of them will let you go hunting. And then if you find anything, share your finds with them. My grandfather had a lot of morel hunters on his property, and he always appreciated it when someone would give him a share of their findings. The other thing is, when you're going on public property, this would be typically your parks and state forests. You'll a lot of times need to get permits for these locations if they do allow you to hunt for mushrooms on the property and actually collect them. Know the park rules about harvesting, and then keep in mind that not every mushroom needs to be harvested. We might find a whole bunch of morels, but mushrooms will produce spores, and those spores are needed to essentially propagate themselves and produce more the following year. So if you find a morel that's maggoting, just leave that one behind. It's still producing spores that can go out and create more morels. And then another thing is, it's not okay to go off trail. A lot of times, I know Western Ohio is very different from Eastern Ohio. We have a lot of ravines here out on the eastern side of the state. There's potential hazards. And then also some areas like Hocking Hills, for example, they have a lot of vegetation that will not hold up if there's a lot of foot traffic on it. So keep to the trails. A lot of times there's still plenty of mushrooms that appear close enough to those trails. So if you're wondering, well, how do I know if ODNR will let me go onto a public place to hunt for mushrooms? So they do have a website that is great, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. If you go to their main page, there is an option, I think, to click on mushroom hunting and then go to see the state forests and parks that do allow hunting. In Ohio, there's generally just 4 locations. One is actually near you. Maumee State Forest does allow that. However, I still advise to contact the park ahead of time. Make sure that there's no additional permits that you need to have. Close to me is Harrison Hills State Forest. And then on down towards the southern part of the state is Shawnee and Brush Creek State Forest. Okay, so now we'll dive into the mushroom because we're going to be talking a lot about mushrooms today. And sometimes I catch myself, I use the term mushroom and fungi interchangeably, and that's not entirely accurate. But all mushrooms are the fruiting body that is produced by a fungus. So the analogy I like to use is an apple tree. So we have the entire apple tree and it produces the apple fruit. So when we think about fungi, fungi are analogous to the apple tree, and then the mushroom is analogous to the apple fruit that's produced. A lot of times these mushrooms, they'll produce spores that are released into the environment, and they can be spread by wind, rain, or even assistance from humans and animals. Once those spores are released and they find an ideal habitat or they encounter the appropriate conditions for germination, those spores will essentially develop into these filamentous structures called hyphae. Hyphae will continue to develop, eventually forming a thick mat, which is called a mycelium. And then once the conditions are right for reproduction to occur, that mycelium will start to produce fruiting structures called the mushrooms, and then the life cycle repeats itself. So I am going to test your knowledge for the next few slides, and we're going to take a quiz. So what I want you to do is type your responses in the chat on what you think these are, or I should say if you think it's a fungus or not. So go ahead and put your responses in the chat. Okay, so a lot of you are saying, yes, this is a fungus. You are correct. This is a tinder polypore. Tinder polypores are pretty cool. They were often used as a substitute for leather, and I know they some folks like to make substitute leather hats out of them. What about this one? Is it a fungus or not? Yep, so we've got some responses. This is not a fungus. This is an epiphyte, or as Lori said, a pipe plant. It doesn't have chlorophyll in it, hence that's why it's completely white in color. It doesn't use photosynthesis to produce its own food. But what's interesting about these plants is that they feed on the mycorrhizal fungi beneath the soil surface. So there is a fungal interaction involved here. What about this one? Fungus or not? So this one is a fungus. It's a type of coral coral fungus that I will talk a little bit about this group in general here in a minute. But these ones are some of my favorites. They come in all sorts of colors. And sometimes, like when I was living out in Maine, I encountered a whole mass of fungi just like this underneath some shrubs, and they were just growing everywhere throughout the mulch. So it's kind of cool when you discover these ones. What about this one? Fungus or not? So we've got several no's. Oh, we're getting some mixed answers here. So, yep, Jackie, you are correct. This is a lichen, and specifically this is Cladonia, which is commonly known as British soldiers. Most of us are familiar more with British soldiers as having the red cap, but this is the reproductive stage of that lichen. So a lichen is a relationship between a fungus and algal partner. And there actually has been recent research has highlighted that there's an additional fungal partner, a yeast, involved in that complex. Now, there's some debate on whether or not this relationship is truly symbiotic or more parasitic, where the fungus is parasitizing the algal partner. What about this one? Fungus or no? So some more mixed answers. This one is another example of a lichen. It's a little bit different coloration than what we're familiar with. There are different forms of lichen. There's the crusteose, fruticose, and foliose. And this one is probably more like a crust-like lichen. So that would fall in the crusteose category. All right, so on to some general questions. Go ahead and put your responses in the chat. This is true and false. All mushrooms are fungi. Yep, you are correct. This is true. All fungi are mushrooms, or all fungi produce mushrooms. So this one is false. While we have a lot of fungi out there that do produce mushrooms or some sort of fruiting body, we also have some fungi that focus strictly on asexual reproduction. So they don't have a true reproductive structure. You can tell if a mushroom is poisonous by its color. This one is going to be false. A lot of times I get calls from people who say they found a white mushroom in the yard and it must be the meadow mushroom. Not necessarily. There are actually quite a few white mushrooms out there that are quite deadly. So we can't really tell a mushroom what it is or if it's edible by its color. And really, when we get into species, there's a lot of color variation even within a species. So we have to be careful. Your friend eats a mushroom and appears fine. You can eat a mushroom of the same species and be fine. What do you think? True or false? So we got some no's out there. So this is false. And the reason for that, and a good example I'll use myself, I can't eat morels. I get very sick if I try to eat them. So even though morels are considered to be an edible species, not everyone handles them the same way. So we have to be cautious with that as well, know our limitations. If you're trying a new mushroom for the first time, start out small. Don't, especially if you have not eaten, say, morels in a while, you want to eat just a little bit at a time and see how you react, because you can also change throughout time on your reaction to it. A mushroom is a plant. This is probably the biggest one that historically, back in pre-1900, mushrooms or fungi were considered plant-like organisms, but really what DNA testing has shown us today is that fungi are actually more closely related to animals than they are to plants. Plants photosynthesize, they get their nutrients from sunlight, whereas fungi don't do that. They have to produce their own. They get their nutrients from the substrate that they grow on. A material a fungus grows on determines its toxicity. So this one is, it can. It depends on what that substrate is. So fungi can typically break down complex molecules into their smaller forms. But when it comes to things like heavy metals that are already in their elemental form, they're not going to be able to break that down. And they can essentially accumulate this in their tissues or in their mycelium. So you do want to be aware of where these fungi are growing. Mushrooms that squirrels or other animals eat are safe for humans. Yeah, that's definitely not true. For starters, you don't know if that squirrel has eaten a mushroom and then it goes out somewhere and just kicks the bucket. Sometimes toxins produced by different fungi can take a little while to kick in. Sometimes it's a few hours, sometimes it's a few days, sometimes it's up to a week. So we do have to be careful with that. All mushrooms in the backyard are safe to eat. Of course, hopefully everyone knows that that is false. We do get a lot of amanitas in the backyard, that some of them can be quite deadly. And then poisonous mushrooms can be detoxified by parboiling, drying, or pickling. So this is false with a caveat. And the reason I put this in here is because in Europe, it's actually common practice to boil certain mushrooms to get the toxin out of that mycelium. The trouble is you never know how much toxin or mycotoxin a fungus contains just by looking at it. Size is very deceiving. A small mushroom can actually have a quite concentrated dose of a toxin. And it was not unheard of to have a family that, say, did not boil their mushroom long enough to get all the toxins out, and they would be found a week later at the dinner table. So generally speaking, poisonous mushrooms, we want to be careful. That said, technically speaking, morels, you should not eat morels raw. They do need to be cooked before you eat them because they do produce a mycotoxin or something that doesn't necessarily sit well with our digestive systems. Okay, so we've talked a lot about mushrooms and what makes a mushroom. I want to zoom out to kingdom fungi in general. These are organisms that range in size from very, very small, sometimes microscopic, to extremely large, and they come in a variety of forms. One of the largest organisms on Earth is actually a fungus. Now, that said, you're not going to go out into the wild and see a ginormous mushroom out in the middle of nowhere. Much of that growth actually happens beneath the soil. Remember when I was talking about mycelium? That mycelium grows along, grows within that substrate or that soil or whatever material they're breaking down. And that can contribute to size. So Armillaria ostoya is one of the largest known species on Earth. And they have found a specimen that's about 2 kilometers in diameter. And once again, that's not, you're going to go out into the middle of Oregon and see this giant mushroom. Much of that growth is actually throughout a woodland area where that fungus has grown up and is actually parasitizing trees. It is estimated that there are approximately between 1.5 and 5.1 million species of fungi. Of course, we also have species that are no longer here today, although I wish they were. A good example here, we have a drawing of Prototaxides. So scientists currently think that Prototaxides was a gigantic fungus that grew up to 25 feet in height. So if you can imagine walking out into a forest of fungi rather than trees, that'd be an interesting experience. So what makes a fungus a fungus? First of all, fungi reproduce via spores and not seeds. I have gotten the question before, what exactly is the difference between a spore and a seed? So they are both reproductive units of a that parent organism. So spores, fungi, seeds are from plants. But the main difference is spores are more microscopic, whereas seeds, they have a bit more structure to them. They've got a seed coat, they've got a nutrient source, and then they've got the embryo inside. Spores don't have any of that. Fungi are heterotrophic. So if we think about plants that are autotrophic means they get their nutrients from the sun. Heterotrophic means they're very much like us in that they have to go out and get their food manually. So a lot of times they digest their food externally and then absorb it into their hyphal tissue. Some fungi are unicellular. Probably one of the most common one of those is the yeast. And then we also have our multicellular, which for fungi, that includes any of those mushroom producing species. And then the vast majority of fungi are immobile, and I put usually in there because there's always an exception to the rules. If you're familiar with chytrid fungi, there's a notorious chytrid fungus that's known for decimating frog populations across the world. But some chytrid species are known to kind of swim around. There's also slime molds, which are not true fungi, but if you watch them closely over the course of a few days, you might notice that they will move from place to place. Where can you find fungi? Fungi are essentially everywhere. They're in leaves, stems, roots, wood, especially mulch. If you ever go out and take a closer look at your mulch, you'll probably find tons of different mushroom or fungal fruiting structures appearing. Bird's nest fungi is one I commonly see in mulch, but you really have to know what you're looking for to see it. Dung, of course, tends to do well. I think horse manure is commonly used in mushroom cultivation. Skin, whether you like it or not, we are covered in fungi. That said, not all of those fungi are going to be producing mushrooms. CDs, if you still own CDs and you take those CDs down into the tropical areas where you've got a lot of humidity, warmer temperatures, there are fungi. Fungi primarily feed on carbon. CDs, they mostly contain that. So if you bring a CD back from the tropical areas, it might have what look like little etch marks in there, but essentially that's the fungi that are harvesting that carbon from that CD. Space, fungi are incredibly durable. They have been found on the International Space Station, mostly causing damage to equipment. So they can tolerate a wide variety of extreme environments. So fungi are probably fall under one or more of these categories here. The first is decomposers. A lot of our mushroom producing species would fall into this group. That is, they're actively decomposing dead plant tissue. One of the common things that I see working with clientele in this area is I get a lot of questions, is my tree dying? One of the things I like to do is have them look at the tree and see, do they notice any fungal fruiting bodies coming out of that tree? Because if they do, if they see any mushrooms growing out of that tree, generally it means that tree's on its way out. And that kind of ties over into pathogens or parasites. Some of those fungi that are producing mushrooms on trees, they might be active pathogens where they're responsible for killing off that tree, but most of the time they're more not accidental, but secondary invaders. That tree was already on its way out, so they're just taking advantage of one in decline. And it's not just trees, it can be many other plants as well. Probably one of the neatest groups is the mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae are fungi that form symbiotic relationships with plants. And through this relationship, the plant is getting nutrients from the soil that maybe it has a harder time reaching. A good example would be phosphorus. In exchange, that fungus is getting carbon or carbohydrates from that plant. And then endophytes, I'm not really going to talk about too much because they don't produce the mushrooms that you might encounter out in the woods. These are mostly invisible. They grow within plant tissue, and they help protect plants from herbivory through the production of certain mycotoxins. Okay, so I'm next going to talk about fungal diversity and how different groups are broken up in field guides. But first, are there any questions? If not, we'll go ahead and plow forward. So in terms of how field guides group fungi, the important thing to keep in mind is there are so many different species of fungi out there, and there's not enough mycologists in the world to study them. And furthermore, a lot of genetic analyses are still ongoing, and we're finding out that a lot of different fungi, they look very similar, but they're actually not at all related or very distantly related. So that's a process through what we term convergent evolution. So through different mechanisms and different environments, we end up getting a similar form for an organism. So the first group are the slime molds. I mentioned slime molds are not true fungi. These organisms are actually closer to amoebas. When they start fruiting, they'll coalesce to produce a plasmodium. I always trip up on that word. But they come in all sorts of really cool shapes and sizes. Now, these ones are generally not edible. Typically, when you touch them, they tend to dissolve pretty quickly. But if you get a chance to look at them up close, and sometimes you have to look really close at a surface to notice these ones, they're pretty cool to see. Ascomycetes, or these, sometimes you might hear the term sac fungi, although I think sac can sometimes be a misleading term because it mostly pertains to the structure that the spores are housed in that kind of resemble a sac. But this is a broad category of fungi. It includes some of our edible favorites, such as morels. It includes some interesting looking mushrooms, such as Piziza. It also includes a lot of our plant pathogens that we encounter. And then the photo here in the middle with the dark structures appearing out of the moss are earth tongues. Puffballs and friends. So this includes, of course, our one of our favorites, giant puffballs, but also includes some of our nemesis, such as the stinkhorn. Stinkhorns, of course, they are often grouped in this group because when stinkhorns are immature, they oftentimes have that egg-like structure that kind of resembles a puffball. If you split a stinkhorn down the middle, though, and you look at it, it kind of looks like a rotten egg. Keep in mind, the smell of the stinkhorn is not for you. They're mostly using that to draw in the flies. The flies will land on that mushroom and then spread the spores. Then we've got our bird's nest fungi, which produce spores on these structures called peridioles. So I've got one up here in the upper right-hand corner. You can see those little egg-like structures. So what happens is when it rains, that rain will essentially wash out the spores and carry them to a new location. And a lot of these ones are found in mulch. And then similar, we have earth stars, which are very similar to puffballs, except they have an exterior layer or an exoperidium that expands. Then you get the puffball-like structure that releases the spores when the proper environmental conditions present themselves. Corals and jellies, as I mentioned before, this is some of my favorite groups, and they're just so cool to come across. Some of them are considered edible. However, there's a lot there. These ones can be challenging to identify, and not everyone reacts the same to them, even for the species that are considered to be edible. So I would use caution. Usually these ones are just really cool to look at and take pictures of. But they have, the reason they're called, some of them are called corals is because they look like the corals that you would encounter at the bottom of the ocean. And then there's the jelly fungi that, as their name suggests, they kind of look like a glob of jelly. Tooth fungi will produce these teeth-like structures. The spores that are produced on these ones essentially are produced along the surface of these teeth. One of the more common edible species is lion's mane. You can easily grow this one at home, but it is a type of tooth fungi. And some of them do have a typical cap and stem structure, although most of the ones that I can think of are typically similar to bracket fungi, or that you'll typically find them growing off of woody surfaces. Polypores. So I'm going to ask you, how many species of fungi do you see in this slide? Go ahead and put your answers in the chat. Thousands? Yeah, technically, you're not wrong there. I should say, how many types of mushrooms do you see? So the correct answer is 2. So the ones that we have on the left-hand side are actually all belonging to the same species, turkey tails. They come in a wide variety of coloration. That a lot of that depends on strain and the environment that they're growing in. So that just shows that you can have a lot of variability within a species, and that color is oftentimes not a reliable identifier. Boletes. These mushrooms have a porous surface underneath the cap. Typically, now there are always exceptions to the rules. For example, there is such a thing called a gill bolete, but it is more closely related to many of the true bolete species. And these ones, they come in a wide variety of colors. Here is one I actually found in the Carrollton area on the lower right-hand side, and that's frost bolete. And I believe, looking at iNaturalist, this one has been also found up in northwestern Ohio, so you might encounter it. This one I found sometime in July. Boletes, there's a lot of edible species, and there's also a lot of poisonous ones, so you really got to know what you're looking at. And then probably our more iconic mushrooms, or what we think of when we hear the term mushroom, are going to be the gilled mushroom, or the gilled mushrooms. There's a lot of variation within this group. Definitely one of the larger groups that we will encounter, and a lot of times we can separate these ones out and help narrow down what species they are by looking at the color of their spores through spore prints. So you can't tell a spore's color just by looking at the underside or looking at the gills underneath the cap of the mushroom. Oh yeah, the ones that turn blue when they're touched are pretty cool. There is a bolete that, I think it's king bolete, when you pinch it, it's a yellow mushroom and then it bruises blue. And that can be very helpful for identifying down to species. All right, so on to identification basics. So it's important to get familiar with the general structure of mushrooms when you find them, because of course this is going to be important for identification. And some field guides will use your typical terms like cap, gills, stem, ring, but these also have scientific terms too that you might encounter in some of the more advanced or field guides or some of the identification keys. The cap, for example, might be called a pileus. Gills might be referred to as lamellae. Stem is oftentimes called a stipe. The ring is the annulus, and the cup is the vulva. So the annulus is essentially a remnant of a veil that covered the gills when that fungus was immature, or that mushroom was immature. And then as it grew, that veil broke apart, leaving behind a ring. The cup structure is essentially the remnant of a universal veil. So a good example, stinkhorns, I mentioned, they have that egg-shaped structure when they're young. As they grow, they break through that veil, and you end up getting the cup structure or the vulva at the base. It's important to note, not all mushrooms will have these anatomical features, so you want to get to know which ones have them and which ones don't. But keep in mind that sometimes dealing with cups and rings can be deceiving. As a mushroom matures, it can potentially lose that veil, that remnant of that veil, or that cup structure might not be noticeable. So it's always important to get multiple specimens when you're trying to identify these. Identification can be done through the shape of the cap texture, the cap margin. So does it have a smooth margin, or is it more kind of wavy? Is it convex, concave? Those are important to note. gill attachment. So if you look at the underside of a mushroom and you look at the gills, are they directly connected to the stem or the stipe? Or do they kind of end before they reach that stipe? Stipe placement, so is it directly in the center, off to the side? Is there even a stipe present? Is important. And then stipe shape, does it kind of get more bulbous toward the base, or is it pretty standard diameter throughout? I've already talked about the veils, the partial and the universal. Smell and taste. So when I say taste, I don't mean eat. I mean take a little bit, chew it, spit it out. And that said, there are some mushrooms that you don't even want to taste a little bit, like deadly Galerina. It's got deadly in the title for a reason. Size, this is one, it's important to know the size range of the species you're dealing with, but size can be deceiving because a lot of times the size changes throughout that lifespan of the mushroom. Color, I've already said before, don't rely on color. I mean, it can help narrow down some things. Color changes are more important. So that bruising from yellow to blue, that can help identify down to species. And then spore prints. So a lot of times I get asked, how do you take a spore print? You can use just standard printer paper or construction paper. I usually like to take 2 colors out into the field with me. I like to have a white or lighter color paper, so that way when I find a mushroom that produces darker colored spores, it's easier to see. But then I don't necessarily want to use dark paper to put that those dark colored spores on. So for the lighter spored mushrooms, I might want to use the darker construction paper for that. But essentially, you remove the stem, you place the cap face down. If you're taking these specimens home, it's important to, when you remove the stem and put the cap face down on the paper, cover them with a bowl, because a lot of times these mushrooms are producing tons and tons of spores, especially when you're dealing with mushrooms like oysters. They can actually pose a respiratory issue. So if you put a bowl over them, that prevents the spores from being dispersed all over, say, your kitchen. But the color of that spore print is highly important for recognizing species. In some cases, we're going to talk here in a little bit about parasols, but there's an edible, one considered to be edible, an edible parasol, and then there's one that is deadly that you don't want to try. And how you distinguish those two is mostly through the color of their spore prints. When you're going out hunting mushrooms, and this is if you're hunting them to either create specimen collections or to eat them, there are several things that you want to bring with you. The first off is the basket or mesh bag or a paper bag. Whatever you do, avoid plastic. And I can speak from experience. One time I got lazy, I just had plastic on hand. I put mushrooms in there, threw them in my fridge, and what did I have the next day? A ton of maggots. So plastic tends to hasten decomposition. Plastic tends to trap moisture that essentially allows for that mushroom to break down rather quickly, or whatever's already growing on it to really take off. Baskets or meshed bags are great because they allow for, if those mushrooms that you collect are still producing spores, those spores are getting released into the environment as you're walking back to your vehicle or walking back to the house. GPS units are nice, especially if you're hunting for ones like morels, shaggy mane, oysters. A lot of times they'll appear for multiple years in the same location. So if you can track the GPS coordinates, then you can go back to that site the next year and see if they're still there producing mushrooms. Cameras are always helpful anymore. Everyone has a smartphone, or I shouldn't say everyone. A lot of folks have a smartphone. And you can actually take some really good pictures of mushrooms. And I would recommend taking pictures, especially if you're going to eat your specimens and you don't have enough to save a specimen, because should you get sick from that, you're going to need something to show the paramedic so they can diagnose what's going on. Pocket knives are helpful. You want to reduce the amount you have to clean when you take those mushrooms home. So cutting mushrooms at the base rather than ripping them out of the soil can help make that process a lot easier. You want to avoid washing mushrooms when you get home because, once again, that's introducing moisture. that mycelium acts like a sponge, and that can hasten decomposition. And then paper for spore prints. Like I said before, typically white printer paper is fine. And then I like to take a darker color out and kind of tape them side by side. So that way I can just take a cap, put it down, and then see what the spore color is and easily see it. Some things that you want to note for observations are the date. If you're finding, say, a morel in September, guess what? It's not a morel. So dates are important. Locations are important. A lot of times mushrooms or fungi in general have very specific habitat requirements. So if you're finding something that is growing in a place where it shouldn't grow, then you might want to double check that identification. Weather, of course, is important. Generally, if we get a lot of summer rains, then we can expect a flush of mushrooms to appear for many different species. Growth patterns, a lot of different mushrooms will produce fairy rings, or mushrooms that grow in circles in yards and lawns that we might notice. Sometimes we'll notice fairy rings in forested areas. They can also appear in clusters, scattered, or just maybe you'll just find one mushroom out on its own. But noting those characteristics goes a long way towards identification. Noting the substrate that it's growing on. So substrates can include soil. It might be the wood that fungus is actively breaking down. Maybe it's growing directly from a certain type of plant tissue. That's important to note. And then also check nearby vegetation. Species like Armillaria, which is a known parasite of a lot of different tree species, as well as other plants. They can, I think they can even parasitize raspberry plants and potatoes. Knowing what types of plants are around can help kind of narrow that down, or help you identify what association that fungus has with certain plants. Mycorrhizal fungi, for example, some of the mycorrhizal fungi have very specific associations with certain types of trees. So when we're talking about mycophagy, which is essentially mycophagy is the eating of fungi. Always be careful. Bring in a good identification guide and be 100% sure of your identification. Don't be 99% sure or 99.9% sure. You need to know exactly what you're eating. And when in doubt, don't eat it. Do not eat mushrooms other than store-bought mushrooms raw. Even morels, like I mentioned before, anyone who eats those raw, likely you're going to encounter digestional upset. Do you really want to eat that mushroom that's crawling with maggots? Leave that specimen behind. It's likely still has some spores on it, and it can help towards producing even more mushrooms later on. Eat one species at a time and avoid consuming large quantities. If it's the first one of that kind that you've ever eaten, start small and then see how you feel. And then, have you ever heard the saying, there are old mushroom hunters and bold mushroom hunters, but there are no bold mushroom hunters? That's around for a reason. Now, that said, I do know of some very bold mushroom hunters who are still around, but even so, use some caution when you're going out hunting. Okay, so now on to what you actually might encounter in the Lake Erie region. Are there any questions up until this point? If not, we'll go ahead and take a look at some of the mushrooms that you might encounter if you're out at the wildlife refuge. So this by no means is a comprehensive list. There are tons of fungi out there. And as I said before, there is not enough mycologists in the world to study them all. There are some what we call little brown mushrooms. We have no idea what they are. So just keep that in mind. Don't assume that it's edible. Everything's edible. Always consult a good field guide for identification. And once again, a reminder, we are not responsible for misidentified mushrooms. Make sure you're taking those identification guides that you need out into the field, or better yet, find someone who's an experienced forager, go out with them. Attend fungal forays. So the Ohio Mushroom Society frequently offers forays during the spring, summer, and fall months. That's a great place to go out on a hike with fellow mycology enthusiasts and find different mushrooms. And a lot of that knowledge can be shared during those events. It's one thing for me to talk about it on a slide, but it's another thing to see it in person. Okay, so the first one I'm going to talk about is probably one of the more common ones, turkey tail or Trametes versicolor. So it gets its scientific name, the Trametes versicolor, because of its color variation that we already talked about early on. You can see these are 3 different strains of turkey tail that appear in different hues. We've got a bluish gray one to a yellow one to one that's more of a brown, a golden orangish brown color. These ones are saprobic polypores, so they do grow on plant material that's already dead. And they are often studied for their medicinal value, frequently studied for cancer treatments. I will say, so you might come across some things on the internet that say turkey tail is a cure for cancer. If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Right now, the studies have mostly been inconclusive on that. A violet tooth polypore or Tricaptum biform. This is one of the more common ones that you'll encounter in North America. This one is found in all 50 states and in all provinces of Canada. A lot of times you'll notice these ones in clusters on, once again, dead or decaying wood, very much like turkey tail. If you look on the underside, they oftentimes have a purplish color if they're young enough. As they mature, this purple color might eventually turn brown. And then on the top side of the cap, you might notice some green that looks like algal growth. But they typically have zones of whitish and gray colorations, occasionally fringed with lilac purple. One that you might find out in the Ottawa area is the little nest polypore or Poronigulus contrifer. This one is an interesting one in that it kind of resembles bird's nest fungi when it starts out. So this picture on the lower right-hand corner, you've got these little cup structures. And initially on seeing these, you might think, oh, that might be bird's nest fungi. It just hasn't developed those peridioles yet that will produce the spores. But actually what you'll notice if you watch this one as it ages is it becomes more porous. So what's interesting is they will develop pores on the underside of the cap, and then sometimes, and it might be a little hard to see in this photo depending on the size of your screen, but you can also get pores on the top side of the cap as well, which you can see in this upper photo. This one is also saprobic, so it grows on dead or decaying plant tissue, and it's primarily found on elms. Silverleaf fungi, or Chondrosterium purpureum, is a pathogen that does attack living plant tissue. Primarily, it's found on members of the rose family, so you might see this growing on an apple tree. A lot of times, it can transition from being a pathogen to a saprobe, or something that breaks down dead plant tissue. What's interesting about this one for the silverleaf fungus is that it is sometimes used as a mycoherbicide of different weedy trees, although I don't know if they're currently using that in Ohio for any invasive species control. So it looks like we do have a question in the chat. Why will little nests grow in northwestern Ohio wetlands? So little nest is one, if you pull it up on iNaturalist, it comes up across the Toledo area. Wetlands are great places to find different fungi because a lot of fungi require moist environments to grow. You won't necessarily find them growing in standing water, but when you start getting down into low-lying areas where moisture accumulates in the soil, or where it helps allows plant material to decay more rapidly, that's when you might encounter some fungi in those areas. Split gill mushroom. So this is Schizophyllum commune. This one is found across the globe. It's one of the most common fungi that produces mushrooms out there. It's found on primarily deciduous wood. If you're seeing something that looks like this and it's growing on a conifer tree, probably not splitgill. It does not have a stem. If you look at it, where it connects to the base, it pretty much looks like the cap is just fused to that branch that it's growing on. And what's interesting about this one is it's very much like chanterelles. If you look at the underside, it does not have true gills like a lot of mushrooms have. They actually have folds within the tissues that make it seem like it has gills, or gives it the name splitgill. Oyster mushroom, or Pleurotus austriatus. This is a common one that you can actually purchase online to cultivate, but you'll also find it in Ohio, or this species in Ohio. Pleurotus austriatus is the tree oyster. A lot of times the wild specimens are have a white to a light brown cap that is fan shaped. A lot of times you'll see them, or you should see them, in clusters growing from the bark of a tree. They have light colored gills that are not serrated. And if you look closely, if they do have a stem or a stipe, it's going to be very short. And a lot of times it's going to be hairy. When you get a spore print, it might be white or even a pale lilac gray color. And this is one that if you find it out in the woods, you might want to GPS it, because chances are it's going to reappear in that same spot up to 3 years. And not only that, they also appear both in the spring and the fall seasons during cool, wet periods. A lot of times you can, as I mentioned before, you can grow these ones at home on grain-laden straw, or really these ones are adapted to most agricultural byproducts. I think research has shown they grow best on soybean hulls or cottonseed hulls. If you have access to those in your area and are interested in growing oyster mushrooms. Chicken of the woods, or sulfur shelf, is Lachyporus sulphureus. This one is considered to be edible, but you do want to watch the surface that it's growing on. For me, I've tried this one before. I don't know if it's the name sulfur shelf, but it's kind of put in my brain that it tastes like sulfur. But a lot of people say it tastes like chicken. To each his own. But you want to be careful with this one. So the edible species are growing on deciduous woods. If it's growing on locust trees, sometimes this fungal specimen can pick up compounds produced by the locust tree that might result in digestional upset. Also, there's a similar species that looks nearly identical, except it grows on coniferous trees. So once again, pay attention to what that mushroom is growing on. This one is considered to be a pathogen, but it also grows on dying wood. So if you have a tree in the backyard that's growing this type of mushroom, hey, it's great. It might be an edible mushroom, but it also means your tree is in decline and probably should come down at some point in the near future. And this one, spore prints, once again, you want to get those. The underside of the mushroom is not necessarily going to represent the color of the spores produced, and this is a prime example. If you look on the underside of a sulfur shelf mushroom, it looks yellow, but it does produce a white spore print. Dryad saddle, or pheasant's back. So I've been given the 5-minute warning. So we're going to speed through these last few slides pretty quick. Dryad saddle, or pheasant's back, usually appears the same time as morels. It's considered an alternative edible mushroom to morels. That said, you want to make sure you harvest them early enough. Some have said that they have kind of like a texture similar to watermelon when harvested at the appropriate time. Hen of the woods, maitake, might be another one. You encounter Grifola frondosa. Warlock, or witch's butter. So typically it's warlock's butter that you'll see. It's a type of jelly fungus that's black. Witch's butter tends to be more yellow in coloration. But once again, spore prints are deceiving. This one will produce a white spore print. The fan-shaped jelly fungus, Dacromyces spatularius. This one is a type of wood decay fungus. Once again, it kind of looks like jelly. Oh, what was that last one too fast? So this one is warlocks or witch's butter. Nope, the one before. Hen of the woods or maitake. So this one is a fleshy polypore. It is a type of butt rot in trees, and it is considered to be one of the prime edible species. That said, even though it's considered by a lot of mushroom hunters to be one of the easier to identify, this one tends to have a lot of, you'll find a lot of differences between specimens. So you do want to be careful with this one. And keep in mind, if this one is one you can purchase online, a lot of companies will claim it has medicinal use, but these claims are often not rooted in science. Very much like the turkey tail, a lot of that research has been inconclusive. We're going to skip over puffballs. Giant puffballs, fairly easy one to identify. That's a common edible species. These are ones that you might find growing in a fairy ring or circle of mushrooms. While it is edible, once again, you want to harvest at the right time, typically earlier when the interior is still white, is the best time to eat them. And then when they mature, they turn brown, and typically you wouldn't even want to try them at that point. Common earthball or Scleroderma citrinum. These ones tend to produce a tough outer rind. This is different from puffballs. The puffballs don't really have that outer rind. Like you can see here, it kind of looks scabby. They do produce a spore mass that is white when it's immature, but it turns darker or purplish black when it matures, as you can see in this upper right-hand photo. These are mycorrhizal, so they do have specific associations with certain plants, but a lot of times you'll see them growing on moss or rotting wood, which may give the perception that they are saprobic or decomposers. What's interesting with this one is it can be parasitized by a type of bolete fungus. It's very interesting. You might see this bolete fungus, and then at the base it looks like there's the common earth ball that it's growing from. Milky caps are some of my favorite. They come in a wide variety of colors. This one up here, you can find the indigo milk cap in the area. It might be a little harder to find because it is eye-catching, and typically when someone sees it, they might collect it. Some of the milk caps are edible, some not so much. So you want to be careful. They tend to be more brittle. If you look at each of these photos, so each one of these is a different species, but the cap generally has these concentric rings or rings within rings, and that can be a key identifier for your milky caps. And I should say these ones, while some of them have bright colors, a lot of them are an identification nightmare. You do have to look at the spores to identify many species down to their actual species. Brittle gills, this is belongs to the genus Russulas. These come in a wide variety of colors, very much like the milky caps, but likewise, they are an identification nightmare. Probably the most famous one or infamous one is the Russula emetic, which is also known as the vomiting mushroom. And it's vomiting because guess what it causes you to do? A lot of times these ones will just crumble apart in your hands. Parasol mushrooms, I mentioned before, this is one you do want to get a spore print. So chlorophyllum is the one that's poisonous. If you look at this middle photo up here, you can see the spores have fallen out on the cap of the mushroom beneath it, and it's bright green. If you look at the gills underneath, the gills are going to appear white. So these are often shaggy, scaly caps. They appear alone or scattered. Velvet foot is a very pretty one. It's one of my favorites. Late fall winter mushroom. I believe this is another one that you can actually order from some mushroom farms online to grow at home. But they have a distinct velvet-like coloration or texture at the base. Mycenoids, if you talk to a lot of mycologists out there, they get all excited when they hear about the mycenas. They come in all different colors. They're extremely small and extremely hard to identify. They are not edible, or at least as far as we know. But a lot of times they can be difficult to identify, and there's just so many species out there that it can be a challenge. But one of the common ones that you can identify is the orange mycena. This one has marginate gills, which if you look at the mushroom in the lower left-hand corner of the screen, you'll notice that there's a darker orange coloration on the edge of the gill. And that's what gives it its color and how it can be identified. A lot of times this one is found on dead hardwoods, and you'll see it in clusters, as you see in this photo here. Pleated ink cap, this is a common one. Mica cap, very similar, and they can oftentimes be mistaken for mycenas. A lot of times these grow on dead wood. Mica cap gets its name because it has this mica-like texture on the surface of the cap that can wash off during rainfall. Shaggy mane is considered to be an edible, but not one that you should throw directly in your refrigerator, because if you do, it will turn to black ink. A lot of times, and palatability on this one is debatable. A lot of times it's just the experience. But you'll see this one in lawns, a lot of times forming rings, and sometimes you'll even start to notice them dissolve in your lawn. Aborted entoloma. This is another one of my favorites. It's a parasite of an armillaria. It's a parasite of a parasite, because armillaria is also a parasite of trees. Whenever it's parasitizing those mushrooms, it will form what is known as the aborted looking mushrooms. However, when it's grown by itself, it can produce a very generic looking mushroom. Chanterelles, typically these are out July, August. Sometimes you'll find some in September. Typically that mid to late summer period. They come in a wide variety of colors. You'll find them on the forest floor. You will not find them growing on rotting wood. If you find it growing on rotting wood, it's not a true chanterelle. And also, true chanterelles have folds instead of gills. And then morels is what we'll end on today. Morels have a brain-like cap. There are a couple lookalikes out there, but the main way you tell a morel apart from others is when you split it down the middle. They have a single chamber. They won't be broken up into multiple chambers, and they won't have tufts of mycelium growing on the interior. There are many types of morels out there, generally broken down into 3 different groups. There's the Rufobrunia clade, or the red-brown mushroom, or red-brown morels. These ones are commonly, if you're familiar with morel cultivation, they do cultivate these ones out in Asian countries. The yellow morels, if someone tries to sell you a yellow morel online to say you can cultivate it, guess what? You're probably not going to be able to have much success, because those ones are truly mycorrhizal dependent, and that is very hard to replicate in a home setting. And then the black morels, these ones, a lot of times when you go out west, they're tied to fire. If there's a forest fire, the following debris might start producing those black morels. But in Ohio, they're pretty common early in, well, I should say mid to late March is when they start appearing before the yellow morels appear. Always be aware of poisonous mushrooms. If it glows and you think it's a chanterelle, it's probably not. And once again, that green spored parasol you really want to be careful with. In terms of storage, essentially don't soak your mushrooms in water. Store them at, for most mushrooms, store them in the refrigerator at 34 to 35 degrees Fahrenheit. And you also want to keep in mind that different mushrooms will decompose at different rates. Oysters tend to be done for within 2 to 3 days. And always keep an extra specimen available just in case you need to call a paramedic. Tons of online resources and databases. iNaturalist is a great one to see what mushrooms are growing in your area. I like Mushroom Expert because they have a lot of useful keys that you can, a lot of useful dichotomous keys that you can work your way down to species. Michael Kuo, who's the author of that website, will not tell you if a mushroom species is edible or not. It's strictly like for identification purposes. Mycobank is a good website to see if there's been any species name changes, because there's a lot of changes going on in the mycological world. And then OneZoom is kind of a cool way to see how different organisms are related to one another, so you can kind of go through and explore the fungal branch of that tree. Join a mycological society. I already mentioned the Ohio Mushroom Society does fungal forays. They're a subsidiary of the North American Mycological Association, which has a lot of great resources on their website. OSU, we do have a few resources. One of our more popular fact sheets is the wild mushrooms one that you can find on ohioline.osu.edu. And we do have a field guide. If you go to any one of our county extension offices, they might have a copy available, or you can also order it online at extensionpubs.osu.edu. So with that, sorry, I think I went over about 8 minutes. I'll stick around for any questions. I know since we're over time, if some of you have to leave, that's perfectly fine. But feel free to shoot me an email. This is my contact information. Give me a call. I'm more than happy to answer your questions.
Erika, I want to thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I'm impressed that all 22 participants stayed with you the entire time you were speaking. And this is testimony to the quality of your presentation and to the caliber of the programs that we have put together in the last 3 years. Many of them have been attended as well as yours have. Not all, but it's a joy to see such a crowd hanging in there with the presenter. So I enjoin you to look at our calendar, gang, of future programs. If you go to the events calendar that TJ put on the web, that last link, our website has an event drop-down calendar, and you'll see what's going on next month. We have 2 programs coming up in March. So does anyone have any final questions for Erika? If you do, you can simply unmute yourself and talk, or press your space bar and do so. I'll give you a minute to try it and do that. Go ahead.
We have a question from Paul Jasic. Tom?
Go ahead. Who's got that?
It's from Paul Jasic. Any tips for finding and seeing elf cups and slime molds? Erika, question for you.
Yeah, generally those are found on well-rotting logs. Now with slime molds, they're not necessarily feeding on that particular substrate. They are just kind of hanging out, getting enough. They want environments that are fairly moist. The other thing is slime molds tend to feed on other fungi or bacteria in the soil. So a lot of times it depends on the species. They tend to pop up rather randomly. One of the more common ones that you'll encounter is the dog vomit slime mold, which can sometimes pop up in yards after rainstorms. But essentially it's just the conditions are right, that plasmodium forms, and then they start reproducing that way. And elf cups are saprobic, so they're primarily found on well-rotting wood. So if you have an area that has a lot of decaying trees, that might be a good spot to look for. And I found a lot of like the different cup fungi. If you look closer to the ground, sometimes those conditions are more humid. You might have more luck there. I found eyelash cup that way.
Thank you,
Great
Erika.
question.
We have no more questions, Tom.
Real fine, thanks, TJ. Okay, gang, I'm going to let you go by closing the program. If you want to contact Erika, that you know how to do it. There's her contact information. So thank you for attending, everyone. Good night, and have a great rest of the week. Bye-bye now.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah.